Hello and welcome to this week's instalment of Nucleus Investment Insights. We have another special guest this week in Peter Singer, who has been labelled, perhaps rightly, as the world's most influential living philosopher. Singer first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. His other books include Practical Ethics, Rethinking Life and Death, One World Now, and The Most Good You Can Do. He's the founding president of the International Association of Bioethics and of the organisation now known as Animals Australia. In 2005, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and in 2009, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age included him among the most influential Australians in the past half century.
So today we've got Peter Singer on the podcast. This is a little bit of a different take to ordinarily where we're really trying to dig into the investment themes that we can get from our guests and where they're going to change the way we invest within our portfolio. Today we're looking at Peter, who's one of the world's foremost ethicists, and we obviously run a number of ethical screens in Nucleus's portfolios, letting people access different areas of their investments. So what we really wanted to do was to get Peter on there to talk through what we've done with our ethics portfolios and how he sees that sitting, and in particularly some of our views around positive ethical investing and how we tend to try and separate your whether you're donating versus whether versus what you're doing in your ethics. So the idea for us is that the whole idea about do no harm within your portfolio and try and do good elsewhere in your life, and really getting Peter's views as one of the world's foremost ethicists on what we're doing within these portfolios.
After the interview, we'll then look at some of the wider investment implications that these themes can impact on how we invest money every day here at Nucleus Wealth. I hope you enjoy. Today on the show, we have philosopher, ethicist, author, and founder of philanthropic organisation The Life You Can Save, Peter Singer. Welcome to Nucleus Investment Insights.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be with you.
So, Peter, I thought we might just start by, just for our audience, if you wouldn't mind offering up a little bit of background about yourself and I guess your drive to make a difference in the world.
Okay, so background on myself. I was born in Melbourne in 1946 and educated at the University of Melbourne, studying philosophy and history. Went to Oxford to do graduate work and specialised in ethics, and really have been working in ethics for all of my life since then. Taught a bit at Oxford and in New York, then came back to Australia and taught at Monash University for more than 20 years before going to Princeton, where I've also now been 20 years, although I still have a connection with the University of Melbourne and I'm back there for part of each year. My major interests in ethics have been in applied ethical questions, or sometimes it's called practical ethics. I've been particularly interested in global poverty and what we in the affluent world ought to be doing about it. And I've also been interested in the treatment of animals and what's wrong with the way we treat animals and think about animals. Essentially, the moral status of animals, I suppose, is really what I've been focusing on. I wrote a book called Animal Liberation, published in 1975, which was credited by some with triggering the modern animal rights movement. And I've been involved in a variety of animal groups in Australia, including being a co-founder of what's now called Animals Australia, which I think is now the largest animal organisation in Australia.
Fantastic. Oh, well, that's quite a history and certainly a solid background. I thought we might just quickly move into, I guess, and you didn't touch on it there, but the driving force, I guess, and from reading your book recently, was this thematic of effective altruism. And I was just wondering if you might be able to just provide your background rather than me rehashing it, the differences between, or what I guess effectively what is effective altruism, and also the core differences to that, which a person would assume was just doing good or being good.
Right. Well, effective altruism is a movement that's about 10 years old. I didn't really start it, but one of my early articles, I said before I was interested in questions about global poverty and what we ought to do about it. So I had an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality published in 1972, one of the first things I published. And then I wrote, when I got to Princeton in 1999 and the early 2000s, I wrote a couple of articles for the New York Times Sunday magazine. And then I wrote this book, The Life You Can Save, came out in 2009, and the 10th anniversary edition is just released today. So that's one aspect of effective altruism. Essentially, I'm saying we ought to be thinking about others, so we ought to be altruistic to some extent, not necessarily in everything we do. I don't expect anybody to be saints and be purely altruistic, but one of our aims ought to be to make the world a better place, especially where we can easily make a big difference to someone else's life at a small cost to ourselves. So that's the altruism part of it, and that certainly had an influence on the start of the effective altruism movement. But the effective part of it is also very important, and that's been focused on more by some of the other younger people involved, people like Toby Ord and Will MacAskill, who started trying to do calculations about the difference in how much good you can do by donating to one cause rather than another. And they found out that there were just enormous differences, multiples of hundreds of times or even thousands of times as much good that you could do for a given, let's say for a donation of $100 than with one organization rather than another. And so they started trying to publicize this, and eventually an organization called GiveWell was set up that had researchers just evaluating the effectiveness of organizations. So, and then The Life You Can Save, which I founded after the publication of the book of that name, started doing the same kind of thing. So global poverty is only one aspect of effective altruism, but it's looking at how you can assess the effectiveness of what you're doing, how you can find the most effective organizations. And I have, as I've been saying, looking at that particularly in the field of extreme poverty, because I think the amount of good that we can do by donating to people who are extremely poor in low-income countries really generally is vastly greater than the amount of good we can do by donating to charitable causes working in affluent countries. But there certainly are other things that I support. I've already mentioned looking at animals and the treatment of animals, and there's an immense amount of suffering that you can reduce, I think, contribute to reducing in the field of animal suffering, especially the suffering of animals in factory farms, because the number there is just so great. And some of the people in effective altruism are particularly focused on trying to reduce the risks of our species becoming extinct, because they see that as the greatest catastrophe that is imaginable. And even if the risks are not all that great, when you calculate the consequences, reducing a risk of 0.01% to 0.0001% actually works out at having a lot of value.
Okay, sure.
And that sort of, I guess that leads into where what I wanted to sort of discuss with you about the ethical investing side, because we've sort of come, and I guess we've inspired by some of your writings, we've sort of looked at that and had a real think about, from our perspective, what is ethical investing, and for my part, I've had a look at a lot of different places that do ethical investing, and there tends to sort of be three versions of it, and I'm not so sure that that they're actually doing as much good as what they could possibly do. I think from that perspective, and my take is that you have positive ethical, where people say, okay, well, I'm going to go out and try and find companies that are going to save the world, and I'm going to invest in those, which is very difficult in terms of saying, everyone's out there trying to invest to make money, and you're saying, well, if I'm going to try and find a company that's both cheap, it's good quality, and it's going to save the world, you've limited your portfolio to not very many stocks, and most of those stocks tend to be quite expensive as well, because there are people out there who are sort of investing on that basis. Then you've got the sort of negative screens, which say, well, do no harm. I'm not going to invest in companies that don't sort of sit well with my own ethical views, so I'm not going to say, for example, some people say, well, for gambling, I might know somebody who's a problem gambler, and I think that's terrible. And other people think, well, that gambling's fine; it's a bit of fun. And then say tobacco is another case where people might have exactly the opposite view. The person who likes gambling doesn't like tobacco, and vice versa. And then finally, you have the best of breed, which sort of says, well, we're going to look at all companies and say for somebody who doesn't want carbon, someone who's got an aversion to having anything with carbon in their portfolio, they might end up buying a gas producer because they're better for the environment than an oil producer. But at that stage, you're starting to get to the stage. Well, maybe I didn't want any carbon in my portfolio, though. I just didn't want the one that's doing the least damage, or I'm buying a tobacco manufacturer that is quite ethical in terms of how it advertises versus the worst tobacco companies. And so of the three different types, the sort of best of breed seems a little bit disingenuous. The positive side also has the problem that when you're looking at positive ethical investment, there's a case about what is your money actually doing. So if I said to somebody, well, I think you might actually lose money. Here's something that's say a wave company that's you might actually end up losing money over the next few years with it, but you've actually helped the industry. Is saying, well, surely there was something better you could have done with your money than give it to another investor. And so my take on the four different takes. Actually, I might stop there and actually before I sort of delve too much deeper and say, well, so from an ethical investing point of view, how do you see the most effective use of people's money?
Well, I suppose the first question relating to what you said about the Save the World companies is, are you really thinking of this as an investor or as a donor, as a philanthropist? So I a little while back put a bit of money into a startup that's trying to replace foie gras. Foie gras is a very cruel product. It's produced by force-feeding geese or ducks so that their liver actually gets diseased, gets so enlarged and so fatty that it makes this gourmet product. And this company believes that it can make this product at the cellular level just by using cells rather than by using whole animals, which, if it's successful, will cut out the entire industry. Now, so I put a little bit of money into that, but it was a bit of money that I thought, if I lose this, well, it will have been a donation to something that had a reasonable chance of success, and maybe, who knows, maybe I will make money out of it if it's a huge success. But obviously, it's a highly speculative investment if you want to think of it an investment at all. And I think that's an appropriate attitude to have to these sort of save the world companies. Maybe it will save the world, and maybe it won't. But as long as you don't mind losing the money that goes into it, and you'll think, well, it was well spent, because after all, you can't guarantee results, and there was a good chance of a payoff. Then I think that's fine. Otherwise, I think I agree with your approach that says different investors have different priorities, and that seems to me to be the way to go. But I would also like to get into dialogue with investors about what priorities they do have. And in particular, as I said, I think some of those things are, let's say, you might object to them, but they're doing less harm than some of the other things. So I think that we ought to be thinking about which are the really big issues. Now, climate change is obviously a huge issue. Climate change has the potential to make hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people refugees. If, for example, rains fail in parts of the world where peasant farmers rely on rainfall to grow their crops and to be able to just survive in the areas where they're living. And if rainfall patterns change, temperatures rise, they might have to leave their country. We know that some small Pacific island nations are in danger of being submerged completely. And that gets a lot of attention, but fewer people realize that there are much more heavily populated low-lying delta regions like in Bangladesh and the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, where people could also lose the productivity of their land as it becomes saline through rising sea levels. So I think there's this is an enormous issue, and I do think it's right to focus on that. How hard you want to go. I noticed in your points you talked about not investing in the use of coal. That's a big no-no. I think that's certainly the dirtiest fuel, and that would be one thing. Whether you have any carbon at all is another, and I suppose whether you positively invest in companies that are trying to find new forms of clean energy would be another thing altogether as well.
I guess what I don't.
So I do think we should think about those issues, and then we'll try to work out what we want to do in those issues and how strict we want to be.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I'm coming from. Is I'd argue that saying, well, let's take the carbon side and saying, okay, well, if you have somebody who's got quite a strong view that yes, this is I don't want to profit from I don't want to sit my investments profiting from the sale of things that are polluting the atmosphere, then I can say, okay, well, let's cut that out. I guess where I'm coming to on the positive side is saying, okay, let's say you've got some sort of clean energy that you're looking at. If you go and buy a share from another investor, I don't think you've done anything or you've done very, very little. I think that the effect is almost immeasurable in terms of what you've done. I think if you invest in a company that's doing a capital raising, so they're actually raising money to go out and spend money on the investment, then I think that's a big positive, or certainly but a bigger positive would be actually buying the product they've got. So saying, I think most companies would actually much prefer to have another customer rather than another shareholder, if that makes sense. So I guess if you think he's a good solar product, then buy the product. Don't feel as if they'd be happier for you to do that than give them more capital. And then at the top is saying, well, there's a donation you could make as well. So the donation is probably going to be even more helpful to the whole factor, if that makes sense.
Yes, that definitely does make sense. I suppose there are some cases where you can buy a product. So if it's making a solar hot water or photovoltaic solar cells, you can certainly buy that and put it on your roof, and you should do it. In terms of the power that you get, some companies will allow you to specify that you want green power. I'm not sure whether that's now universal around Australia or in other countries of the world, or others you just have to accept the mix that the power company is giving you. But I take your point that buying a share from one investor and from another doesn't make a lot of difference. I suppose there could be an argument, you would know more about this than I do, that if more people buy the shares, the price goes up, and the company is more likely to say, oh, well, we could do a capital raising and expand what we're doing now, whereas if the price is falling, that might be harder to do. Would that be correct? Yeah,
I think it's absolutely right. I just think that's one of those ones that's so hard to measure, though. It's very much at the margin. And I think if you said to if I said, okay, I'm going to spend $10,000 buying shares of this company, I might move the price up, half a cent or less than half a cent or whatever it is in terms of the whole. Whereas if I say to the company, next time you're doing a capital raising, I'm ready to go. I've got my 10,000. I'll register. I'll register with Investor Relations and give me a call, and I think that's much more effective, I suppose, in terms of now they're saying yes or no. I've got that $10,000, and I'll go and add more from others or investors and get enough to do my capital raising.
I think too, it's interesting, and it's important to frame in the context of the style of investment as well. So, for example, the investment that you mentioned before, Peter, with effectively money that you're happy to do good with, but if it disappears, then you realise it's highly speculative. It's probably it's almost the inverse to our thinking, where look, we've got a superannuation product. It's a long-term, competent investment solution, which we then offer the ethical tailoring piece. And because of the nature of superannuation, for example, you literally shouldn't really go and put money into companies that can evaporate your capital, as in those plays you're doing. So I guess the hard bit for us is that we're sort of confined to the top end of the investment spectrum, being mega cap investments, but also then saying, well, look, at the top end of it, ethics are important as well, particularly to the everyday investor. So through our 28 odd screens that we offer, we give people the ability to put their fingerprints really ethically on their portfolio. I guess, if anything, so it goes in lockstep with the rest of their, the rest of the way that they live their life. And you're right. I think it's difficult. We're not buying a handful of BHP shares because of global warming, concerns or something like that. As you say, it may not influence the direction of BHP at the margin, but at the same time, if everybody does it, as you say, it starts to indicate to the company, well, if the share price has been under pressure, no one's buying it because we're doing the wrong thing. Well, perhaps we better start looking at better ways of doing it, or avoid doing it altogether.
Right, and of course, if you're running investment funds, then you're pulling together a lot of investors, and it's not just the $10,000 purchase of BHP, which I agree is not going to make any difference. But once you're talking about putting many millions into shares of a particular company, I don't want to particularly pick on BHP, but whichever ones it is that you think are doing the wrong thing, then that presumably can have an impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, I guess that's the whole point. If somebody has an ethical mindset in the way that they run, the way that they live their life, then I guess naturally, it's great to be able to offer that through their retirement savings and other investments as well.
Yeah. There's a couple of other questions I guess I wanted to sort of apply to you as an ethicist. There's obviously a lot of stuff coming out now on China in terms of the Uyghur treatment and issues in terms of Hong Kong. I guess the thoughts are, what are your thoughts around investments in China or in Chinese companies, or within that whole sort of state-owned entities versus private companies sort of area?
Well, it would certainly be good to send a message to the government of China that there could be economic consequences from the treatment of the Uyghurs or the suppression of the protests in Hong Kong. I mean, I suppose as far as Hong Kong is concerned, the real issue is to let China know that if they really were to interfere directly in Hong Kong, that there would be very serious economic consequences for them. So I do think that it's reasonable to do something about this, and there's also, of course, the espionage issues that had a lot of attention recently. I mean, it's hard because China is such a huge country itself. It's obviously got its own huge domestic market, and the idea of sort of cutting off trade with China is really hardly feasible. We're so intertwined with all of that. But direct investment in Chinese companies that are sort of run by the government, or closely monitored and controlled by the government, I think that's that is a problem in the present situation. And if there's a way of sending a message to the government of China that its policies are not going to be beneficial for China's economy in the long run, that would be a good thing to do.
And so, but I guess what I'm trying to get to, and I probably should have phrased this question a bit better. So let's say I've got whatever it is. I want to spend 15 minutes of my time to do what I can to sort of on that particular issue. Am I better off combing through my portfolio and finding stocks exposed to China and looking to sell those, or am I better off writing letters to my local members and actually trying to do something on the political side? So I guess that sort of sits, I guess, across most people's investments. I'm sort of using this as a microcosm for other things out there about saying, in terms of this effective altruism, where's the best spend of my time for these types of factors?
So, of course, and you could ask the same questions about climate change as well. I do certainly think that on those issues we ought to be active citizens, and probably it is more important to be an active citizen. Perhaps to write to your MP, perhaps to join in climate strikes or whatever other activities, or for that matter, to send a donation to organisations that are trying to do more on climate change. All of those things are important. In the case of China, it might well be more effective to be an active citizen than to try to screen out those Chinese companies that might be in your portfolio. But again, as you're pooling investors, and you have staff who could spend more than 15 minutes doing this, that would seem to me to be a filter that you could offer, to get offer the possibility to people to show their concern about what China is doing by saying we can put together portfolios that do not hold investments in Chinese companies.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've done that, but and we obviously look at we look at it from the side of saying, okay, we'll let people make that decision themselves. We also look at it from an investment perspective, obviously, that if Chinese companies are spying and cheating, and that's how they've got to where they've got to, is that's not a sustainable business model. And so,
probably fairly profitable in the short run, but
yeah, that's right. Yeah, great for the short. But so it's not something we'll say, okay, yeah, let's invest in this company because they're the best at stealing technology from Western countries, and also, we have an investment view that the real crux of, say, America or Australia or the UK's technological dominance over some of the other countries is the people, and the freedom of expression and things like that actually then inspire people to think out of the box. Whereas we think in repressed countries, it's very hard to say to people, no, this is exactly the way you shall think about the political system. Now go out there and be innovative in all these other places, and don't start thinking out the box over there, but you got to think inside the box over here. We don't think that actually creates sustainable companies that can grow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Just a quick one, Peter. I thought I'd just quickly, obviously, pick through your book over the last couple of weeks, and fantastic read, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But you touched on I guess a theme of what could be described as philanthropic graffiti, which I found quite interesting. And you gave a number of examples there. One was a concert hall, which was essentially plastered with all the major donors. And it sort of struck a chord with me because then, in a similar time, I think it was last week, there was an announcement with Jeff Bezos recently donating a fantastic amount, 100 million US, I think it was, over the last 12 months to help with homelessness. But then, of course, when you reflect this against as a percentage of his net worth, it was a fraction of 1%. Are you finding, I guess, or perhaps your just thoughts on the topic of philanthropic graffiti, and is it something that is becoming more endemic, I guess, as the rich seem to get richer?
Yes. So the graffiti stuff is really about, are people just giving to get their names on something? And is that why there's so much money going into new buildings? Look, here I am at Princeton University. Across the road from my office, there's the Lewis Science Library, which was a Frank Gehry building, a very expensive building on campus. Donated money from Peter Lewis, did the campus, and there's also a Peter Lewis Art Centre. Did the campus really need these buildings more than it needed anything else, like hiring more people to teach, or scholarships for needy students, or something like that? I don't know, but I do know that some of the philanthropists are keener to donate to buildings that will have their names on them than they are to donate to scholarships where there's no sort of visible presence, even if it's called a so-and-so scholarship. It's not something that you walk around the campus and see. So I think that does have a distorting effect on philanthropy, and I regret that, because part of the effective altruism movement is that we want philanthropy to be as effective as possible. And that actually, since you mentioned Jeff Bezos is donating $100 million to homelessness, I really hope that somebody, either he set it up or someone is checking how successful this is, because we've had some of these dramatic donations. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg gave exactly the same amount to Newark, an impoverished town in New Jersey, just across the river from New York, to improve the schools. And some of the follow-up articles I've seen about that suggest that this was done hastily, without too much consultation to people who really knew about the problems of the school systems of Newark, that a lot of it was swallowed up in consultants' fees, and that essentially that $100 million has been spent without there being any really dramatic changes in the quality of schooling in Newark. Now, that's just a report I've read. So I'm not saying that I know this to be the case, but, these things are really opportunities to learn how you can make a difference. And homelessness specifically, everybody who lives in the United States, in a major city, is well aware of the problems of homelessness. Of course, people are in Australian cities as well. The question is, can we do something about this, and at what cost? And one of the reasons that I've talked about global poverty rather than the poverty of people in wealthy countries, and homeless people in wealthy countries, is that My estimate is that you can help people in low-income countries and transform their lives in a positive direction for a small fraction of what it costs to transform the lives of homeless people in affluent nations. Now, I'd love to be proved wrong by that. I mean, proved wrong by the idea that you can effectively transform the lives of homeless people in affluent nations. Not, of course, that it's more expensive to help the lives of people in low-income countries. I think we have very good evidence that when you're talking about people who are living on $2 a day, quite modest sums of money can dramatically improve their lives. But is this going to be true for homelessness? And if so, what is it that we do? Is it that we give them mental health opportunities to have mental health issues treated, or to have substance abuse issues treated? Or is it just that we provide shelters, shelters that are different from ones that are run now? We don't really know, I think. And my concern is that, that money could have been much better spent, because it could have helped a much larger number of people if it were allocated to the charities that we know are really effectively helping people on very low incomes in low income countries.
Yeah, I guess one pushback on that as well is that if you look at sort of the income inequality statistics, it seems to show that income, obviously the 1%'s done really, really well over the last, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever period you measure it. On a global scale, though, the bottom end, the poorest countries have actually done quite well as well in terms of moving up. And a lot of it seems to be at the cost of the poorer people in richer countries, which is then arguing as to why you get, say, a Donald Trump or a Brexit, or I guess a number of more extreme, susceptibility to people who are less careful with the truth, shall we say, than others, and willing to So I guess do you have a thought on, at some stage, if you donate too much to those poorer countries, you actually disenfranchise the 99% of the bigger countries, and you end up with sort of demagogues being voted in?
Well, I think if you're going to talk about inequality, you have to talk about that on a global scale. And the fact is that somebody who's earning $40,000 here in the US, which is they're certainly not going to think of themselves as being in the top 1%, but globally they are. $40,000 puts you in the top 1% of the world. So although it may be true that those people may be disgruntled, and that we need to do more to meet those concerns, I think that if you are concerned about inequality, you can't just look within the affluent countries. You have to look across boundaries, and there are really effective ways of helping people on very low incomes, and probably helping the people at the bottom of the low income countries is not really putting people in America or Australia out of work, because they're still not part of the global economy, even if they get above the $2 a day level, and so have enough to eat and can afford some minimal health care if their kids get ill. Still, they're participating in a local economy rather than making products for export to affluent countries.
Yeah, and I think that whole sort of economic rationalism, or I guess more simply put, bang for buck element, it sort of rings true. Myself, in a Rotary Club where we had $30,000 to spend on a project a couple of years ago, and we ended up helping out an orphanage in Tanzania. We did a 4-kilometre boundary fence, solar panels, hot water service, books, and etc. Whereas if we were going to do something like that in Australia, 30,000 wouldn't have covered the permits for the fence.
Yeah, right.
So I think you're right. Just the ability to get so much more out of a certain amount of money, and like anything, we've only got limited resources, and so you go, okay, well, following those tenets of where can you do the most good. Obviously, it was a lot harder to instigate that through Rotary being an international organisation. You can find partnership clubs on the other side to help manage that, which takes away a lot of that project risk. But yeah, look, 100%. I think I agree where you're going. We met the other when we did meet a couple of months ago. You were over chatting for a Financial Planning Association conference on the topic of ethics, and I guess essentially into financial advice and the financial services industry. And this was, as a follow up to the recent Royal Commission into Banking, which I think, if anything, certainly highlighted the fact that ethical behaviour in the finance industry was due for a tune-up. I was just wondering your thoughts on the way forward for the Australian financial service, industry, and I guess what that can mean to the consumer in regards to ethics.
Yes, I think there have been positive moves, in particular, away from financial advisors earning their income from commissions on products that they put their clients into. That's certainly helped. And I understand that you can't be directly on a commission basis in that way, but there still seem to me to be some loopholes in that you could still be working as a financial advisor for a company that has investment products, and even though your annual earnings are not related directly to the extent to which you put your clients into the company's products, it's still possible that your pay rises at the end of the year, which will follow a review of your performance, will not be blind to how much of your client's money has gone into the company's products. So I think there are still some grey areas in that maybe need to be looked at in order to really clean up the entire industry and make sure it doesn't slip back into something that was not so different from what it was.
Yeah, well said. And I think, even just your job security, I think a lot of the time relies on on those metrics as well. Right. Look, that's a great point.
And that's an argument, though, isn't it? There's a number of financial planners who are basically going the other way, saying, well, if we're doing stuff more like a lawyer or an accountant, and they get paid on an hourly basis, then maybe that's a more effective way that aligns people's
mandate that the exclusion or the separation between the advice and the actual product. Be product agnostic, or build a really good product, but don't try and cross those boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's right. There needs to be some separation there.
Fantastic. Okay, well, look, I thought mindful of your time, and obviously, as we heard before the show, that it's starting to get cold over there in Princeton. So we thought we might wrap up. But first, if we could just, if you wouldn't mind offering up, I thought, considering the conversation we've had today and the thematic of trying to do the most good, we're rolling into Christmas. It's a great time for people to embrace their inner altruism or altruist. And I was wondering if you might be able to share with us Peter's top 5 things to consider to save a life for anybody mulling over helping out another person into the Christmas period.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, but I do want to mention that today is the publication date of the revised 10th anniversary edition of The Life You Can Save, which is the book I wrote, obviously, 10 years ago, and we've revised this and brought it out, but the most important thing I want to say is that although with the first edition it was published by commercial publishers, Random House in the US and Text in Australia, we've got back the rights. Kudos to Text in Australia. They donated us back the rights. Random House in the US didn't do that. They made us pay something for them. But the rights are now held by the non-profit organisation that I founded, The Life You Can Save. And they have decided to make the ebook and the audio book available completely free, and you can get it now as a free download by going to thelifeyoucansave.org.au if you're in Australia, or without the AU if you're not in Australia, and you can get the book. And the audio book in particular is read by a number of celebrities. My favourite is Paul Simon, the singer-songwriter, who I remember listening to back in the 70s when it was singing with Art Garfunkel as Simon and Garfunkel. Also Kristen Bell, who's an actress and works for The Good Place, a TV series that does a lot of ethics. Stephen Fry, BBC talk host and comedian, and a number of other people. So that actually has in it, I am getting to answer your question, that actually has in it suggestions at the back of the actions that you can take to make a difference. And one of them, in line with what we've been talking about, is to go to thelifeyoucansave.org.au, and you'll find a list of charities where to donate. And these are charities that have been independently assessed as being highly effective and will give you great bang for the buck in your donation. And if you're wanting to give a Christmas present to somebody who already has everything that they could possibly need, make them feel good by saying, we've donated to effective charities, or maybe there's a all charities fund that the Life You Can Save has that goes to all of the charities, and you know that you've really helped a lot of people in great need. So that's certainly one thing that I would say that people can do. Obviously, we've talked about getting political as well. I think that's really important, to be an active political concerned citizen and try to make the world a better place through that. We're privileged to be living in societies where we can do that, where there is not a perfect, but clearly a functioning democracy, and we can make a difference. So definitely do that.
And actually, when you say getting active, so do you think, is it joining a party, or is it more just frequent conversations with your local member, or what do you think the most effective way in Australia would be?
If you have the time to get involved in a political party and support that, I think that is the best thing to do. Yes, find the political party that best suits your values, join it. That will involve going to meetings, but also importantly, it'll mean that when elections come around, you're available to leaflet or to hand out how to vote cards at elections, and those are certainly things that political parties need. Plus, you can have an influence on the party, if you remember, by going to meetings and talking about what the policies should be. But if you don't have the time to do that, then simply contacting your member, I think, does make a difference. I think members know that only a small proportion of their electorates actually go to the trouble to contact them, but they take that therefore as something that's representative of a much larger number of people. You can also try to get your views across by writing letters to the papers or blogging or using social media to encourage people to think about the issues that you think are important. So there are quite a lot of things that you can do. And the other thing I wanted to mention, is just to sort of go into the world with a smile on your face and a cooperative approach. I think the assumption, we should assume that people are mostly good-natured and want to do good. Sometimes we'll be disappointed when we make that assumption, but more often than not, we'll be pleased. We'll find that they're happy to cooperate with us in various things, and generally talking to people, being positive. You can work with like neighborhood groups to get people in neighborhoods to know each other better, have street parties and things like that. I think all of those things are ways of building a better quality of life and also communicating with more people about the issues that really matter.
Fantastic. All right, very good. Well, look, we'll certainly pop a link to the Life You Can Save page on your website as well, if you like. And just as a quick getaway, I noticed it was offered on Giving Tuesday. Was there?
Yes, absolutely. We planned the release for Giving Tuesday, and the book itself, as I say, we are giving away, so that's already a gift. But we want more people to read it. We want you to get it, to tweet about it, to put it on Facebook or other social media, and let more and more people know that this book, which already has had a significant influence on the lives of a lot of people, including some very wealthy people who've made very substantial donations, but a large number of ordinary people who've made more modest ones. But let's try and multiply the readers by tenfold or 100-fold, and I think it'll do more good if more people read it.
Well said. Yeah, no, look, and I can attest that it was a fantastic book, and I look forward to. I've already handed it out to a few of my family members. And I'll be
just
doing
have to send them the link. You don't even have to hand it out.
Very true. Okay, very good. Well, look, thanks again for your time, Peter. Love your work. Love following everything you're doing, and we look forward to getting you on the show sometime soon.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
So, Damien, a terrific 40-odd minutes there spent with one of the world's renowned leading ethicists, Peter Singer. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, look, usually we use this as a bit of an investment wrap-up just to sort of go through and talk about how it's changed our views on the portfolio or in terms of what stocks we own and what change we're going to make. I think this one's more obviously about the whole structure of the portfolio and within your investments and how you deal with the rest of your life. You're treating you're treating ethical investment, and I think he's obviously got some quite good points, and I think that's well worth looking at some of these, digging into those sites for your own for your own donation purposes and working out how to be most altruistic yourself. But it does reinforce, and I guess we sort of knew this coming in because we'd based some of the structure of our product on some of his teachings. But that whole thought about really separating between saying if you want to try and do good, try and work out what's the most effective way for you to do it, and giving your money to another investor and potentially losing money, giving to people might feel good about saying, well, I invested in a biotech stock and that stock went down but I was but they did end up with a cure for something, or they tried to get a cure but it didn't fail, and at least I helped. You're saying, well, you might, if you just gave your money to another investor, you probably didn't really help that much. You probably were better off making a donation, going to his website, finding out that cause, or buying one of their products. Whereas the whole idea about making sure that you're not profiting from things you don't have,
you don't believe in.
Yeah. So making sure your investment's doing no harm. So really separating your buckets and not trying to underperform on your ethical investments and feel as if you're doing some good for the world by your underperformance.
And I think there's also some value in having the ability to mirror your ethical tastes, both in long-term aspects such as superannuation, combined with the shorter-term plays, as Peter said, which is the newer entries to market, which are much riskier, can have a lot more impact. But whether or not they should sit in a long-term, retirement-style savings plan is probably another question.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've very much tried to design our product to do the core part of people's investing, and that's the whole idea with us, is that that you will try and stick things you like around the edges of that. So the core of your investment sits in something safe, secure, blue chip stocks, bonds, those types of investments. But then around that, you can invest in higher risk. If there's a lithium stock or a gold stock or something you've got a strong view on, and also if there's something that you do think here's a new energy source that could save the world and make me lots of money, you can stick that in there. But it's not going to be 50% or 80% of your net wealth that's going into that. You're trying to, for your retirement, you're keeping that part safe and playing around the edges with much smaller percentages.
Well said. Well, that's it for now, and thanks for watching. If you like what you heard today and you'd like to hear more, head over to nucleuswealth.com/subscribe. Give us your email address, and in return, we'll send you a weekly email with new webinar topics, links for our podcasts, and other news from Nucleus Wealth. I certainly hope you've got something out of today, as I have, and we'll look forward to catching you with the next one. Cheers.